In tonight's special compilation episode, I bring you 4 stories. The first being my uncle's true possession story, the Gary, Indiana story, the Rain Man, and finally the Coven. Enjoy. The stories I'm about to share with you tonight are personal and happen to my father and uncle. These are the actual accounts of my father's first-hand experiences with dark entities. This first story happened to my father when he was back in high school. I believe he was a senior or starting his senior year when this happened. The year was 1970. The events unfolded in June when my father and a good friend of his, Mike, began playing with a Ouija board at Mike's house. They had started asking it all kinds of things, and to their surprise, they were getting answers. More importantly, they had begun asking it a series of questions, resulting in it telling them a future date. December 16th, 1970. This entity mentioned that it was there to protect them from something. My father claims that it started to spell out something and made it to the words S-I-N, but before it could finish, they stopped it. They were getting freaked out and closed the board up. We need to jump around a bit in time to make more sense of this story. Let's fast forward to December 16th, the date the entity on the board had described, a day when Mike had wanted my father to go with him. I believe it was drug-related, either selling or transporting. For whatever reason, my dad did not feel like going with Mike that day to skip school, so he decided to just stay back. As it turns out, this was the day that his friend Mike would get busted and serve jail time. At the time, he did not remember anything about the board and its warning of December 16th. It wasn't until later on in life he would connect and realize this entity they spoke to knew things that weren't possible. How did it know that would happen, and why did it tell him that it was trying to protect them? That portion still weirds him out. Now, we need to skip back in time a bit to September. This event is 3 months following the Ouija board event and 3 months before his friend Mike would get busted. Although, I believe this would be late September. My father had informed me that Jimi Hendrix had just passed away. My father, who's 17 at the time, gets home pretty late. It's probably about 2 in the morning. Remember the time and era here. This story is right in the middle of the hippie movement, so LSD and cannabis use are exploding. My father was coming down from an acid trip of his own. He parks at the driveway, makes his way up to the house, opens the door, and my dad says the second he opens the door, he can feel there's something in the house. In that instant, he knew in his mind that it was that thing they were talking to on the Ouija board months ago. He said you could feel it. There was this thick, ominous presence. He tells me whatever it was in the house. He believes it attached itself to my father after that board incident and followed him home. That's his speculation, of course. Now, my dad cannot do much about this lingering presence in the house but get ready for bed. So he goes to his room, gets ready for bed. Then he's lying down in his bed, looking up at the ceiling, just tripping hard still because, remember, he's coming down from an acid trip. He's got 2 dogs that are lying on the bed with him. Before I get to the next part of the story, I need to lay out his room quickly. Once you walk into the house, you can take a left down the hallway. On the far end to the left was my father's room. As soon as you stepped inside the room, my father's bed was directly in front of you against the wall. His bed was parallel to the wall, so if he was lying on his back like this, he could turn his head and look right out the door if it was open. This night, he would have his bedroom completely open. So he's lying there, trying to shut his brain down, just staring up at the ceiling, and that's when this entity comes right into his room and stands there in the doorway. I'm going to describe this to you, the entity, as best I can. The way he explained it to me was it was this electrical outline. My father told me that it looked like the artwork cover on Jimi Hendrix's album, The Cry of Love. My dad was convinced that he was looking at the ghost of Jimi Hendrix, or so that's what he thought at the time. Immediately after it appears, there in his doorway and he sees this thing, both his dogs start going crazy at this thing, snarling and barking. And this is when he realized this wasn't just him coming down from LSD causing him to hallucinate. His dogs were both reacting to something standing in his doorway. This entity or being takes one step into his room and begins to wave its arm like this. And as soon as this entity does this, both his dogs immediately retreat in complete paralyzing fear. One dog goes under the bed, and the other one goes up to my dad, and he's trying to nuzzle in his arm, and he's shaking and whimpering so bad, trying to shove his nose in my dad. And these dogs were terrified. He's never seen anything like this. Then, this thing slowly walks into the room towards the end of my dad's bed. It stops, turns to face him, and like a person does when getting on the bed, it puts one knee up and climbs up onto the mattress. He could even feel the weight pressing down on his mattress and visibly see the indentation as this thing began to climb up on the mattress and lay next to my father. So this thing is now lying there next to my dad between him and the wall. As you can imagine, my dad is beside himself, not even sure how to assess the situation further. Then, this thing starts talking to my dad, tells me that this thing starts talking into his ear, and it sounded like this. And my dad, freaked out, turns and looks at this thing and says, "Man, I don't know what you are, but you're freaking me out and you need to leave." And as soon as he says that, this thing gets up off the mattress, stands up, walks out of the room, and then just it's gone. The presence that was so thick in the house when my father first walked in is now completely gone. Following almost immediately after this thing disappeared, my grandfather came waltzing in screaming, "What the hell is all the noise?" Because the dogs had just been freaking out and barking and then whimpering. And you know dogs, when they freak out early in the morning, they aren't exactly quiet. So in the process, it woke up my grandfather, and so he is now questioning my dad, what's with all the noise? My dad tries to explain it to him. I don't know, they probably saw something outside and got them worked up. The situation eventually de-escalated and everybody went back to bed. But this event was just the beginning for my father and would almost be the perfect precursor to what my father would have to deal with 8 years from now in Colorado Springs. This story, like the last, has been shared with me throughout times in my life. The details have always stayed consistent and never changed. I even had the chance to briefly speak about this with my uncle before he passed away, and everything aligns. I do not believe this to be made up or fabricated, and I believe that the events that happened 8 years before this in 1970 was just the beginning. My father, my uncle Dominic, and their friend Bill, and Bill's cousin Malcolm were all renting this house in Colorado Springs. I'm just going to note right here that for privacy reasons, I'm not going to reveal the actual address to the house, but will reveal the general neighborhood. The house was only several blocks away from North Academy Boulevard and Palmer Park Boulevard. This is from a recent picture from Google Maps, and while the entire neighborhood is developed now, back in 1978, much of this land was undeveloped. Large fields and plots of land sat empty long before Colorado Springs became booming like present day. The outside of the house was pretty standard. The backside had an empty yard with a fence and a gate. Going out the gate would lead to a large open field, just an undeveloped plot of land. If you were going to go through this field, you'd end up on an alley heading off in the direction of North Academy Boulevard. My father worked as a manager at a local restaurant, and my uncle Dominic worked as a cook for him. At this time, my dad was dating a woman named Susan. Susan is my oldest sister's mother. They were only dating for a short time but would go on to get married and then divorce years later. These events took place in fall of 1978, going into the spring of 1979. This singular first event is the tipping domino in the series of events to follow. My dad and Susan were sleeping in his bed. Everything was pretty normal, and my father recalls waking up to this loud sound that appeared to be coming from underneath the house. As he's waking up and hearing this, he thinks it's some kind of gas line leak building in pressure. My dad describes it like a train coming from beneath the earth, heading straight up to hit the house. He said not only could you hear it coming, but you could feel the energy coming from underneath the house. And BAM! It hits the house from underneath, causing a massive shockwave to shake the entire house. It only lasted for a few seconds, but enough that my dad gets tossed out of his waterbed like a rag doll. Susan is thrown onto the floor, and the waterbed is sloshing around. Something hits the house with incredible force from underneath. My dad gets up, thinking Dominic was probably being an idiot and knocked over a dresser or something. He comes running into the hallway to chew his brother out, only to find Dominic standing there in the hallway too, just as confused as my father. And they both thought each other were responsible for the noise, but neither could explain what had just happened. My dad only had one option. It was either a gas line buildup that resulted in an explosion, or something really did happen strange that he cannot explain. However, the conclusion is that nothing was ever found. It turned out not to be a gas line explosion like my father initially thought. Little did either of them know, this event was just the beginning. My dad believes that whatever entity from underneath the earth was now in the house. And soon after this happened, maybe a couple of weeks went by, and my dad and his girlfriend Susan were sitting on the couch one night watching late night television. Then, this show comes on, one of the first science paranormal shows to ever air. In the show, a guy talked about how you could take a tape recorder without a microphone plugged in, take it to a graveyard, and pick up all these high spirit frequencies if you hit record. But, of course, tape recorders then needed an external microphone plugged in to capture any noise, because otherwise you'd just be recording nothing on a blank tape. My dad and Susan saw this, and both their interest piqued. They thought this would be a great idea to try, but instead of going to a graveyard, they wanted to test this out inside the house they were in, especially after that mysterious explosion had just happened. So, determined to get answers, my dad goes out to the store and purchases 3 brand new TDK cassette tapes. He gets home, everybody is there at the house, and he explains what he watched and wanted to try out and shows them proof. 3 brand new cassette tapes and opens them all up in front of them to prove they're brand new and never used before. They stick one of the tapes inside this tape recorder, light candles, they turn off all the lights, they're sitting around in a circle, and they hit record. The whole time this tape is recording, it's physically impossible, or should be, for it to be picking up any noise. There's no microphone plugged in. This is not like modern day tape recorders where it has a microphone built in. At least not this specific model. So, my dad and everybody are joking around, making light of the situation. If there's any spirits here, make contact with us. Ooh. Just wholly mocking the situation. Now, about 10 or 15 minutes of this goes by when they decide to stop recording and play it back to see if they captured anything. My dad reiterates that what they had heard back on that tape was enough to make multiple grown men huddle together and cry. They were scared. What ended up on that tape was a bunch of strange, high-frequency noises and what my dad describes as this satanic shouting or yelling, like some entity was trying to speak to them through this tape. My father specifically described it as sounding like a Jimi Hendrix reel being played in reverse. They were terrified now and knew that something was there. They didn't believe any of this was real just 5 minutes prior, and now they're confronted with this new demonic reality. After this event, more things would begin to happen. For instance, the attic door in the house would be found open almost constantly. This is one of those houses you had to go down the hallway, pull on the string to get it open. Then, like usual, you'd climb up into the attic. I'm sure many of you watching this had a house similar to this. It's a pretty universal design for homes with attics. My father, uncle, Bill, and Malcolm never used the attic for anything. They did not store anything up there, so it remained untouched. My dad would get home from work and find the attic door open, asking Dominic, "Why do you keep going up there and leaving the attic door open?" My uncle would tell him he thought he left it open. I mean, he doesn't go up there. They couldn't find an explanation, so my dad just thought, this is weird. Since it was getting later fall, and it was Colorado Springs, snowfall had begun to accumulate. My father decided one morning that he would walk to work. He was only a few blocks away from the restaurant he managed overall, so it wasn't a big deal. At the time, he had just purchased a brand new RX-7, amazing car, but terrible in the snow. So he figured walking wouldn't be a big deal. So that evening, my father was coming home from work, and he was coming up the back alleyway to the house, then into the large open field that would lead to the backyard of the house. As my father makes his way through this field, he notices a separate pair of tracks in the snow, and as soon as he makes it to the back gate of the house, that's where the prints are. They start there in the snow and lead directly from the gate to the back porch. My dad is confused by this because how is it possible prints in the snow can begin here in this very spot and lead to the back porch? It had not snowed any more than before, and the only way to get to this gate was either through the front or the field. And so to have footprints start here didn't make any sense. My dad thought it was very weird, asking Dominic about it at the time, who knew nothing of it. He had been home that evening, and my dad just thought, okay, and tried not to overthink it. During this time, my father brought that same cassette tape to his friends over at his work, played for everybody he could, including his employees. But of course, his friends, everybody who listened to this, were all freaked out. I mean, nobody could explain what he had captured on this tape. There was zero explanation for how these sounds got on the cassette. So my dad at the time wasn't entirely convinced this whole thing was real, even though those noises were unexplainable. So he decides he's going to plan a seance where he invites everybody over. They're going to find out once and for all if there's supposedly a spirit that has made its dwelling inside the home. Is this a spirit? Is it a demon? What could they be dealing with? Now, we get to the night of the seance. And before I go further, let me explain the house's layout real quick. You go inside, you're in the living room. Directly in front of you is the kitchen and the dining space. To your right is a bedroom, and to your left is the hallway with rooms and a bathroom. At the end of the hallway is the attic. Where the seance took place was in the living room. Everybody is holding hands in a circle. You had my father and Susan sitting on a couch right next to the hallway on the left. Then, directly to their left, you had Bill, followed by Dominic, followed by Mike Garcia, a friend of my uncle and father's. Then you had Stephen Black, who's another friend, and then another guy that my father cannot remember the name of. And to the left of him, completing the full circle, was Jack. My father described Jack as the short, stocky, 250-pound little fat guy. That lineup completed the full circle. It's also important to note here where Jack and Dominic were sitting in the circle. Jack was sitting with his back facing the hallway where the bedroom and attic was. If Jack were to turn around, he would be directly looking and facing the hallway. In front of him, facing him, was Uncle Dominic. So, at this point, everybody's holding hands. They have candles lit, the lights are off, everybody's getting quiet, shh, and they're trying to be calm and ask if there's any spirits in the house. You know, the questions you would ask in a seance, trying to get to the bottom of this whole thing. My dad tells me he and his friends at this time were just a bunch of hippie stoners. They don't think this whole thing is real, although strange, but not real. So they're not expecting to get anything out of this seance. But then, that's when things change. What happens next is terrifying. With everyone's eyes closed and holding hands, my dad is leading and asking the questions. Who are the spirits in this house? As he's talking, he feels Jack's hand let go. And my dad opens his eyes and looks over out of response and sees Jack diving out of the way. And then instantly, something slams right into Dominic, and now he's screaming and convulsing in pain. Everybody's freaked out. Susan is crying hysterically. She's begging to go home. They blow out the candles, turn the lights on. Chaos has completely ensued. And they're trying to figure out what's wrong with Dominic. Why is he convulsing? Why is he freaking out? And so finally, my dad looks over at Jack and asks him, "What happened? Why did you let go of my hand?" Jack, terrified, looks at my dad with the most serious expression and explains, "I don't know, man. I don't know what it was, but I felt something come out of the attic, come down the hall, so I dove out of the way. Whatever it was that came out of the attic and down the hallway went right into Dominic." Even though things were chaotic after this, things eventually calmed down with all the commotion, and the seance was ended for the night. My father tells me that this event changed Dominic's entire personality for months to come. And after the seance, Dominic began to act differently. My dad summed it up in one word: weird. He began to act much more like a wild animal, like a wolf. He was growling at people, running on all fours, rolling around in the dirt. There would be days at a time when no one would know or see Dominic, but then he'd come home randomly, covered in filth and dirt and grime and blood all over his clothes. Not his blood, though, but the blood of animals. He would go out and just into the woods and eat animals. He'd howl at the moon at night and run up the walls. There was even a time when he and my father had gone to the grocery store. They're both standing there in the meat aisle, and Dominic picks up a pack of raw ground beef and just starts tearing into it, eating it. Blood dripping down his face and all over his jacket. And my dad just looks over to him and tells him, "You're whacked out. You're walking home by yourself. You're freaking me out." And at this point, my dad isn't convinced that Dominic was possessed. I don't think anybody was. He just thought Dominic was whacked out. A stoner hippie who's took too many hits of acid and smoked too much dope. And he's fried out. Although, in retrospect, my father admits that it was impossible to fake such a drastic personality change for the amount of time Dominic did without something truly being wrong. It's like he had the spirit of a wolf in him or something. And this behavior went on for months. My dad doesn't recall the exact time and place that Dominic realized he needed help, but he enlisted my father to take him around to any church that would assist him. Most of the churches they went to, Catholic and Protestant, refused to help Dominic. They thought he was just some guy who had done far too many drugs and needed deep psychotherapy, or some other form of treatment. However, there was one Catholic church that took his condition a little more seriously. They flat out refused to do the exorcism on Dominic, though. They were scared of him. You know, he's still doing the whole thing a lot, and because of this, they left it up to my father. They told him, "Look, we're not going to do it, so here you go, you can do it." And they gave him the prayer booklet, which, by the way, is not in the Bible. It's just this small little 5x7 booklet containing prayers for the exorcism. It tells you how to make holy water. It's less than 100 pages, and they send my father and my uncle on their way and wish them the best of luck. Now, we're going to get to the actual exorcism. They would perform this in the living room before, where they had done the seance months ago. Dominic, who was sitting in the lounge chair in the living room like this, and you had Mike Garcia from the seance on his knees on his right, and he's on the side of the chair, holding Dominic's right arm down, restraining him. On the left of Dominic, you had Jack. Jack is doing the same thing as Mike, on his knees, holding down his left arm, restraining him. All the while, Dominic is clenching his teeth, moaning in pain. Get it out of me. My dad, who had made up the holy water exactly how the prayer book described, and had the prayer book open. Quick note, directly behind Dominic in the lounge chair is a wall. If you were to go through that wall, you'd go straight into Bill's room, where both Bill and Malcolm currently were. At the time, they were both tripping hard on LSD, keeping to themselves. Even up to this point, my dad did not believe that Dominic was possessed. He was still convinced Dominic was whacked out and done too many drugs and was just doing this all for attention. However, his opinion was about to be changed. Dominic is sitting there in the chair, still moaning and writhing in pain, begging them to get it out of me still. Get it out of me! His eyes are closed, teeth clenched, so he had no idea what my dad was doing. My dad, thinking he's about to pull the rug out from Dominic's whole charade, gets the idea. I'm going to just splash a drop of holy water on Dominic, and he's not even going to notice. He's so full of it. I'm going to prove it. So my dad is reading from the prayer book, and he goes to splash just a droplet, a little blip of holy water on him. The droplet of holy water does not even touch Dominic's skin, but just lands on his clothes. And immediately, Dominic's eyes shoot wide open and stands straight up, screaming in this guttural demonic voice, keeping his arms outstretched like this with Jack and Mike Garcia just hanging off like monkey bars. Okay? My uncle is 5'7" and 165 pounds soaking wet. What's going on right now is impossible. My dad described when this happened, Dominic's face changed and contorted into something ugly, something that wasn't his brother. The scream coming from Dominic was like this animalistic, demonic, guttural growl. My dad, shocked by what is happening, looks down at the prayer book to continue reading, and now the words are swirling all over the page, and for the first time in this entire chain of events, my dad is truly scared. He realizes he's genuinely dealing with something evil. Desperate and unsure of what else to do, he says this thought just came to him. So he calmly put his hand on Dominic's heart and says, "In the name of Jesus, I command you to leave him." And instantly, Dominic collapses in the chair and falls unconscious. And as soon as that happens, they all hear a cry from the room directly behind Dominic. It was Bill. They all get up and rush over to Bill's room, and they open the door. Malcolm is crying and saying Bill's acting crazy. And Bill immediately begins acting hostile towards them. So all these guys are trying to calm him down, and they jump on Bill, dogpiling him to try and restrain him. But he too, like Dominic, pulls a feat of inhuman strength, and he goes, "Ugh!" and throws all 5 guys off him, spiraling into the air. My dad, who goes flying through the air, hits the wall, slides down, hits the ground, and they all go to dogpile him again a second time. The same thing happens. Ugh! Throws everybody up in there. Boom! They hit the wall. They slide down, hit the ground. They do it a third time, and the same thing happens yet again. And finally, after that had occurred, they were able to get him calmed down enough to talk some sense into him. After this had happened, though, Susan was so worked up, she refused to ever come back to the house and had been here for all these events, witnessing everything. Because of this, my father was left with no choice but to move out and in with Susan. Dominic would stay behind and continue to live in the house with Bill and Malcolm. And after this event, Dominic explained just how weird Bill got. Bill eventually moved out months later, and since these events, Dominic and my father lost contact with Bill, so they have no idea what became of him. It's evident that whatever was in Dominic left him and went right into Bill. Unfortunately, my uncle Dominic would pass away in May of 2018 due to liver problems onset from heavy drinking. He's the only sibling out of the 4 of my father, his sister, and his other brother to pass away. The stories I shared with you are what I believe to be entirely true, as told by my father and uncle. I had heard these multiple times growing up, and the details were always consistent, never changing. You could even hear the fear in my father's voice and the emotion as he retold these. He has no reason to make these up.
You in there!
Documented cases of demon possession and exorcism in recent history.
Something was coming from underneath those stairs that was causing the whole house to turn.
Gary, Indiana, a small suburb of Chicago, ridden with poverty, violence, and gang activity. This is where our story starts. Sitting in Gary, Indiana, resides a small home that would turn to be a literal portal to hell. In 2012, the events of Latoya Ammons captured national attention. Ammons and her family claimed that demons haunted their home, and they enlisted the help of a priest to rid the home of the spirits. It became one of the most widely talked about paranormal events in all of history, but to fully understand it in context, we need to go back to the beginning. The Ammons family moved into a small rented house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana in the fall of 2011 with Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rose Campbell, and Latoya's 3 children. Almost a month after moving into the house, Latoya and her family began experiencing strange happenings. They suddenly found themselves infested by black horseflies on their screen and porch, which seemed oblivious to the freezing temperatures. Despite Latoya's attempts to swat insects with flypaper, the infestation persisted. Other events followed one after another, almost simultaneously. After midnight a few times, Rosa and Latoya reported hearing footsteps climbing the basement stairs and a creak from the basement to the kitchen door. Fearing someone had broken in, they waited and waited for the worst. After a while, Latoya finally decided to step out, turn on the lights to inspect, only to find nobody there at all. Locks were even put on the doors to ensure no possible break-in could happen, and it was still happening. Their sounds would range from pounding on the door to animal growls and scratching. Rosa later saw a shadowy figure of a man pacing back and forth in her living room. In response to her fear of an intruder, she lay there paralyzed in bed until morning, then investigated. The family found large wet footprints on the living room floor, despite the doors and windows being locked from the inside. Nothing made sense. It only gets much worse. Tragedy had struck the family on March 10, 2012. The Ammons family was up late due to death in the family. Friends were over, comforting the family, keeping them company, and an unseen force dragged Latoya's daughter off the couch, and after that, one of the boys was thrown into a freezer next to the living room. A short time later, as the children were lying in bed, they were suddenly interrupted by a piercing cry coming from the girl's room, where she was sleeping with her cousin. Concerned, Rosa stormed to the room to inspect the noise source to find her daughter dropping to the bed. She was levitating in the air, according to the cousin. Friends and family began to avoid this house at all costs, knowing a dark presence lingered about. The local churches, Latoya and Rosa, begged for help, turned a deaf ear to their pleas, believing the women were fabricating their tales or imagining. This is when the possession of Latoya's family truly began. Her and her 3 children, ages 8, 9, and 12, finally, after a particularly heartbreaking visit to a tiny community church, a minister declared the house to be haunted and that spirits indeed overtook it. The priest recommended thoroughly cleaning the entire house with bleach and ammonia. Then, they were to inscribe crosses on every door and window. Latoya and her mother also sought the help from additional sources. 2 clairvoyants had informed Latoya and her mother that the house was infested with demonic spirits, 200 of them to be exact. The power source of these demons was emanating from down in the basement. They are to remove the children from the house as soon as possible to protect them from harm's way. Out of desperation and nothing else more that she could do, she was told to make a makeshift altar in the basement consisting of pure white candles to represent holiness and a statue of the Holy Family. She also went through the entire house with a sage stick, burning it and reading from scripture. Psalms 91, praying for protection from God. After blessing every portion of the house, she made it back to the basement and placed the Bible right under the altar, open to Psalms 91. Unbelievably, for a short time, the family had experienced zero activity. They thought they had found peace. However, this is when things began to escalate as they had agitated the demons in the house by doing this. The demons in this home went out to Latoya and possessed her and her 3 children as well. The possession and overtaking of her children didn't seem consistent, but would appear to come and go at times. They had all the makings of acting possessed, eyes rolling in the back of their heads, gruff talking, faces changing, cryptic chants and phrases, and besieged by this unseen fatigue plaguing them. Seeing these children being physically tormented was awful for Latoya. Each child was affected differently. The youngest of her children began talking about what it would be like to die with a new imaginary friend who resided inside the closet. Then, her 9-year-old began talking about the feeling of being murdered, slowly and painfully, very dark, very morbid. Her oldest is 12 years old. Her daughter kept hearing voices tormenting her and telling her she would die, as would her family. Physical attacks also ensued against the entire family in the house. For instance, her daughter was battered against the headboard, causing a gash to her head, requiring stitches. There were other attacks too, like her children being thrown out of rooms by a potent, unforeseen force. Things began to get so bad that the family sought refuge in hotel rooms just so they can get a peaceful night of sleep, dreading going back to that house. Entirely out of desperation, Latoya sought the help of a physician who seemed completely petrified by her story and what she was describing. However, he wrote down mass hysteria, delusions, and hallucinations. Her mental health was his most significant concern, and not spiritual demonic manifestations. The doctor and medical staff would get their real first taste of the demonic realm. On a doctor's visit, going by verbal testimony to staff that appeared there at the time, the two boys began acting strange, cursing at the staff and doctor, growling in deep, low voices. The one boy is even being lifted and thrown against a wall in front of everybody by an unknown force. Both boys also fainted. Panic-stricken and confused, 911 was called, where the boys were taken to the hospital. Doctors and staff present mocked and scoffed at Latoya's stories, only to see that the one little boy of hers seemed to need to be held down by 5 grown men. At this point, CPS got involved. CPS worker Valerie Washington arrived at the hospital to interview the family and examine the children to ensure they were okay. During the interview, the caseworker was growled at and nearly attacked. He got increasingly violent and attempted to choke out his older brother before being restrained. Suspicions arose that the children were performing to align with Latoya's story, so the children were then isolated and brought into an exam room with a grandmother and a nurse. The youngest son began growling and yelling, thrashing about, and going crazy, turning to his brother, telling him, "It's time to die." The older brother became increasingly violent, ramming his head into his grandmother's stomach. Rosa, the grandmother, desperate and unsure of what to do next, just grabbed his hand and began to pray. This was when the older boy had a strange look come over his face and began to walk back up the wall to the ceiling, gliding across over to his grandmother and to land again on his feet, a disturbing display of supernatural power. The grandmother and nurse who were present were so shaken that they both ran out of the room in fear. Rosa was convinced, but an evil spirit controlled her grandson and the entire family. Within days after the events that had just taken place, a caseworker had come into Latoya's home to inform her they were taking her children into protective custody and were considered under spiritual and emotional distress under her care. This devastated Latoya and her children, but what was final was final. While the family had spent time at the hospital, the chaplain had become aware of the case and reached out on April 20th, 2012, to a Michael Maginot, the priest of Martyr Parish in Merrillville. His request was an exorcism for the boy. Maginot proceeded to visit the family after the request, but remained skeptical. On April 22nd, he had seen the home in question. His advice was simple: to rule out any natural causes for what was happening so they would know for sure this was demonic activity. He interviewed them for the following hours and listened to the entire history of paranormal activity at this home. However, during his visit to the house, paranormal activity ensued. There are shadows, wet feet prints developing on the floor out of nowhere, and window blinds swaying. During the same visit, Latoya began complaining of a headache and appeared to be aversive to holy objects. When Michael placed a crucifix upon her forehead, she began to convulse uncontrollably, and it was clear that whatever demonic entity was controlling this household also had a strong grip on Latoya. That day ended, and Maginot, leaving convinced this family was living in a demon's den, and believed there were other evil entities in the house. During his time there, he had gone room to room, blessing each hallway and room with holy water, reading Bible passages as he moved around the house. He strongly encouraged Latoya and her mother to leave the house and never return. Not even 1 week later, Latoya and her mother, a case manager, and 2 police officers who accompanied her were sent to investigate the home's condition. After a thorough inspection of room to room, they found nothing out of the ordinary, and that all changed very quickly. The basement, where they discovered directly underneath the stairwell, was completely unfinished. So unfinished that it was merely a dirt floor with no concrete poured in. This was very strange. The concrete all around it was jagged, as if it had appeared broken, like it was not developed that way or had been removed at a future time since development. Latoya herself admitted that she believed the demonic activity seemed to originate from that same patch of dirt. Considering that under there is where the demons are coming through, there's a portal down there. The experience in this Gary home was so intense that one of the Gary police captains now believes in demons after visiting this house. During that same visit, these officers had experienced strange noises and recordings picked up on their audio recorder that was not there originally during their walkthrough, as done by Lieutenant John Gruska, Lake County PD. Upon listening back to the playback of the tape, there was speech present that was not there originally. Both officers also reviewed footage and photography from that same day in the basement where the stairs were, only to find cloudy white images in all the upper right-hand corners. After zooming in, there appeared to be demonic faces in the clouds. The police captain had also taken pictures with his cell phone, which had strange black silhouettes in them. His personal vehicle and his police-issued vehicle began to have severe mechanical problems that could have caused a very bad accident. Interestingly, in April of 2012, there was a petition granted by the Lake Juvenile Courts to allow temporal wardship of all 3 Latoya's children. According to an investigation, Latoya neglected to enroll her children in school consistently. The youngest of her children was sent to live in a psychiatric care center where he was believed to be coherent and cognitively functional. The odd thing was his obsession with talking about demons. The psychologist firmly thought this was not a possession case, but rather delusion. Latoya, the mother of all 3 children, used the power of suggestion and influence to convince her children that demonic entities possessed them and the entire family. However, Latoya's oldest daughter told the psychologist that she witnessed tall shadow figures in the streets and house, and even went into multiple trances. She also details the strange paranormal happenings all around the home. One of the stipulations that the Department of Children's Services set included having no discussions of demons or being possessed, and seeing a therapist regularly. Latoya was also ordered to find other housing and work. On May 10, 2012, Latoya, Rosa, and 3 police officers from the initial visit returned to the house. Priest Maginot and 2 Lake County officers with a police dog to try and determine if a body was present. At this time, a separate DCS caseworker was called out to the house because the other one was so traumatized by what had happened that she refused to go back. This woman dealt explicitly with horrific child abuse cases and was desensitized to that dark nature of the human condition. However, the incidents featuring the Ammons were so disturbing that they caused her to not go back and to transfer. One of the sergeants was dispatched to the house because 2 or 3 children were not attending school. He noted that there was a crucifix, burnt candles, and open Bibles everywhere you turned entering. He claimed it felt eerie. Now, Rosa, Latoya, and the 3 officers from the initial visit returned to the demon house. With everybody but the priest going down to the basement, they saw a peculiar substance that looked oily, dripping from the wall with no visible signs of where it came from. The texture of the oil or liquid felt weird, and Maginot instructed police to investigate the dirt under the staircase for either occult items or human remains. What's interesting is right around this time frame, the only link that could be suspected being behind the strange demonic activity in the house would be that somebody had placed a cursed object. It just so happens that her boyfriend at the time, whom she was no longer seeing, was secretly married. She did not know this when she saw him and received an angry phone call from his wife, who informed her that she would be very sorry that she ever messed with her husband. And throughout the relationship, several items from around her house had begun disappearing. For magic practitioners, using an object, a personal object from an individual, is generally what you would use to put a curse on someone. The theory at the time that her boyfriend and or his wife was into the occult was never proven, but if so, that he or she was placing a curse on the property. The police down in the basement dug 4 feet into the dirt to find strange objects. Thankfully, no body parts, pentagrams, or cursed objects. Instead, they found a press-on pink fingernail, a pair of children's socks, a metal bar, and a pair of women's panties. There was also speculation that the metal bar could have been used at one point or another to murder, or had some sort of connection with another death in the house. This is because the little boy had an imaginary friend who claimed to have been killed in that house. A record, at least 3 people have died in that house since its construction. While that was going on downstairs, upstairs, Latoya began to complain of deep migraine pain in her head. The caseworker who had touched the liquid, which she also saw in the cabinet, began to complain of an intense pain in her finger and hand. All the blood had also drained out of her hand after touching that liquid, and her hand felt tingly as if constricted. She began having a severe panic attack and left. It is believed that whatever was in the house attached itself to her, as within 30 days after her visitation to this residence, she endured a skiing accident that broke 3 ribs, got third-degree burns from a motorcycle, she broke her hand while hitting a table, and broke her ankle while out on a run. Also, the home inspector, after returning home from this house visit, a tree nearly fell on his car, almost crushing him alive. Choked by an unseen force while sleeping, and developed cancer soon after. It seems anyone who visits this house is simply not safe. The police captain and the other officer also noticed the strange liquid substance appearing in the middle of the blinds in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Perplexed by their findings, they wiped it off and put a Q-tip at the base of the door to ensure that nobody else would come in or could, without alerting them, and potentially putting more oil on the blinds. Suspecting if Latoya or Rosa were messing with them, they would catch it. 40 minutes later, they had returned to the blinds soaked and dripping in this mysterious oily liquid, and nobody had entered the room. They had also inspected the outside, the ceiling, and other miscellaneous areas for any possible explanation of the liquid source, none of which were ever found. This spooked the officers. Maginot informed the officers that this liquid substance signifies a physical, demonic manifestation of possession. Knowing this, he had to act very quickly. As Officer Austin Charles is leaving, he's about 1.5 miles away from the house at this point and pulls into a parking lot into a gas station. And his FM/AM radio suddenly turns to static while he's communicating with another officer. And it says in this deep, demonic voice,
"You in there!"
Maginot had arranged to perform a series of powerful blessings on the house and perform a minor exorcism on Latoya. The case manager and 2 officers attended the exorcism rite, during which the caseworker claimed to feel something unseen in the room. After this, Maginot sought Bishop Dale Melzick's permission to perform an official exorcism on Latoya Ammons. His request was granted immediately, and the exorcism had commenced. Latoya was also instructed to find the names and identities of the demons responsible for inflicting her and her children, since it is essential to call out the names of the demons during the exorcism process. While researching these names, Latoya experienced technical malfunctions, dizziness, and nausea. It's almost as if something did not want her to find those names. But she did. The whole process would take 3 exorcisms. The first 2 were in English, and the final being in Latin. Both police officers decided to offer emotional support to Latoya and her family during the first couple of exorcisms. Latoya fought, she became violent and convulsed, and even fell unconscious at times. The demonic hold over her seemed to lessen after the second exorcism. The final exorcism came in June of 2012, where the ritual would appear to be successful, with only minor convulsions and resisting taking place. Latoya was now possession-free, and shortly after this, Latoya had moved from that wretched house to Indianapolis and would regain full custody of her children in the fall of 2012. The nightmare was not over yet. Sometimes, post-paranormal events of an entity or a demon can attach itself to an individual, like a priest in this case, for example. While nothing necessarily attached itself to Maginot, something interesting did happen near the end of the exorcism. Their parish had several storms come through at that time. One was right after Mass on Saturday, and it was so powerful it knocked out all the lights in the building. Thankfully, they came back on shortly thereafter. Latoya was convinced a demon was trying to lift her in the air, but could not muster the power because they were in a church. But the lights did go out during this time. And finally, a powerful storm came in that knocked the power out of the church for a whole day. Around 30 hours, actually. This would happen 2 other separate times where the power would go out entirely by storm, and the Mass had to be candlelit the entire time. This never happened before, ever. While the horrific events surrounding the Ammons family seemed to end for the time being, a new chapter was about to unfold as the family story was made into the Demon House. Featuring Zach Bagans, star of the Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures. The documentary centers around Bagans' investigations into the family's claims. He purchased the house where the events occurred in Gary, Indiana for $35,000 in 2014. Supposedly, Zach had this nightmare before buying the house that there's this 8-foot-tall goat demon that's very high on the demon scale in terms of ranking in Satan's army, meaning it's a mighty demon that has much power. Zach also had admitted the bizarre events and circumstances surrounding the filming and production of this documentary, like technical malfunctions, crew and production teams getting very sick randomly, people refusing to show up, crew members and staff members just quitting randomly, etc. He personally believes the film is cursed. Zach had tried to reach out to Latoya for commentary, but she refused to be a part of it because the entities would attach themselves back to her again, or so she feared. Her brother Robert was willing to talk and afterwards was refused entry back into their home for the same reason. He made some very interesting and bold claims himself, talking about how the kids would show weird demonic behavior, strange chanting and growling and talking about death all the time, and a very peculiar growling, eyes rolling in the back of their heads, and attacking each other violently. Latoya's mother even recounted how her granddaughter would have episodes where she was saying that she can't take it anymore. The things these beings are saying to her in her head. Her grandson rolled his head around, talking in a deep voice, an evil voice, saying, "I came here to kill, and I'm going to kill." But even with all this evidence on display, there are some holes in the entirety of the story. The first is that Zach has visited the property's landlord for the last 10 plus years, and even he admits that he was unaware of any strange paranormal-esque activity happening. There was also a newspaper article dated from February 15th, 2014, with the headline, "Grandmother of Possessed Kids Insists None of This Went On." In the article, she details that none of what you heard is true, and it's damaging her family name. Bizarre, considering Latoya's mother, Rosa, is the one that lived in the house, witnessed all the events, and did interviews stating that she saw the kids being lifted. Oh, and there's also this supposed ghastly figure in the window that was determined to be made by a phone app. While digging deeper in the house, it turned out to have ample amounts of black mold in the attic and carbon monoxide leaking from the furnace from the chimney, which could cause a person to feel things. Could this explain it all away? And then we have Mika, a girl who lived in the house when she was a teenager in the 90s. Zach convinces her and her kids to come into the house to check it out. She explains that she would have terrible dreams about somebody close to her dying, when only months following, her brother, who lived in the basement at the time, was shot and killed. She stated to Zach that she hated going in the basement, and that is the reason why. On February 20th, 2014, just 2 days after Mika and her kids visited the house, her daughter attempted suicide by overdosing on medication and stabbing herself. Following this incident, one of the crew members also quits immediately. Mika, the mother, details how her daughter became someone else, threatened to kill her own mother. During the shoot as well, Zach and his crew take notice of a black mass that appears on camera for a slight moment in time and eventually enters into the cameraman, where he begins acting strange, almost possessed. Later on, back at the hotel, he began to turn violent and vomit blood and start screaming, becoming completely inconsolable, claiming he's seeing demons in the elevator. Zach claimed that he had changed permanently after the production of this documentary. And speaking of changing permanently, during this production, a good friend of Zach's was killed in a murder-suicide by her boyfriend. The circumstances are just so bizarre and dark. And finally, Zach decides to pull an all-nighter while the house is completely boarded up, every window and every door. His crew and police officers call him crazy for this. During his night alone in this house, completely boarded up and nowhere to go, has an encounter with this demon that causes him permanent eye damage and pain. He claims he is scarred from the making of this documentary and he would not be the same. Finally, to put an end to all the nightmares, Zach had the entire house bulldozed in hopes that the evil that resided there would never return. There have been reports since from neighbors saying that people will still show up on the plot of land at night and perform rituals and other satanic activity. Could Zach's add-on investigation story just be a quick cash grab fiction documentary? Pulling from the credibility of the eyewitnesses and the events of a real story to add credibility to his own film? That's for you to decide. One thing is for sure, the eyewitnesses and individuals who experienced trauma in some way from this great series of events don't believe it's fiction. Sometimes, the past can come back to haunt us, whether it be the memory of an embarrassing action or the regret of a harmful word spoken to another loved one. Although most of us do our best to move on from these experiences, sometimes they linger inside our minds, and sometimes the people who have harmed us can live on through our thoughts. This was the case for Donnie Decker, although his past came back to haunt him in a more visceral way that I'm sure none of us would ever wish to experience. In Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, during the year 1983, a family underwent a life-altering experience. Don Decker, more widely known as Donnie, had been sentenced to 1 to 2 years in prison for possession of stolen property. Donnie wasn't a bad kid, but he had been mixed up with the wrong people. He was planning on quietly doing his time and getting his life back together. He hoped to be able to return to a normal life. As you can expect, this was not the case for Donnie. Donnie was introverted and quiet and didn't get up to much trouble once he was in prison. The warden regarded him as an unremarkable prisoner who seemed genuinely remorseful for his action. He kept his head down and focused on exhibiting good behavior. Donnie had a troubled home life, to say the least. His mother wasn't very supportive of him growing up, and she was definitely not supportive of him now that he had gone to prison. She made it clear that he would not be welcomed back into her house after he had completed his prison sentence. All of this had led him to get involved with criminals. Donnie didn't think of himself as a criminal, but he was willing to accept the consequences of his actions. For now, he was just focused on his life in prison and how he could make it as comfortable as possible for himself. During his prison stay, on account of his good behavior, Donnie was granted a weekend pass so he could attend his grandfather's funeral. The prison determined that he was not a threat to society, so the idea of letting him out of his cell for a few days seemed reasonable enough. Although he was excited to be out of his cell and back into life outside, he was not thrilled at the idea of attending his grandfather's funeral. Donnie claimed that his grandfather was a bad person, that he abused and hurt Donnie as he was growing up. He had terrible memories of a terrible man, and he was still reeling from the horrors that his grandfather had put him through. Donnie wasn't at the funeral to celebrate the life of his grandfather. He was there to be glad that his childhood demon had finally died. During this weekend trip, Donnie was not welcomed back by his mother. She was still appalled at Donnie's actions, and the rocky home environment that Donnie grew up in was partly to blame for his crime. She would not let him stay in the house, and Donnie had to find somewhere else to live. He called up one of his mother's coworkers, and she and her husband had offered to take him in as long as he needed. The Kiefer family was generous and forgiving of Donnie's troubled past. They knew Don was a good kid at heart who had gotten caught up with the wrong crowd. Despite their faith in Donnie's new, rehabilitated image, they were still worried for him. They knew that Don's relationship with his grandfather was a turbulent one. The generosity of the Kiefer family would lead them into a harrowing experience they would never forget. The first night of his stay at the Kiefer household, Donnie went upstairs to wash up before dinner. He was grateful for the generosity of the family, and he knew he would be an inconvenience to them, but he was surprised at how determined they were to take good care of him over the weekend. While he was standing at the sink, he began to feel a sinister feeling come over him. He started to feel uneasy and this sick feeling filling his stomach. He felt a pressure around him that he wasn't able to explain by any natural means, and as he finished washing his hands, he felt the air go out of the room. Donnie felt like he was in a vacuum. He couldn't breathe, and he started to panic. He started gasping for air, and the room went cold. For a brief moment, the air stood still. This silence didn't last long. As soon as he felt this unseen force start to attack him, Donnie was scared and confused, his mind reeling from the invisible attack that he had just experienced. After another brief moment of quiet, the room came to life as the shower curtain flung itself open and the lights started to flicker. The cabinets swinging open and items from the shelves started tumbling to the ground. During this harrowing experience, Donnie looked over towards the door and saw something he will never forget. In the shadows by the door, there was a face. The face of an old man, and on the man's head was a crown. Fear and pain shot through Donnie's body as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before, and as he was at a loss of what to think about this horrifying ordeal, the terror finally subsided after a few moments, and the face that he had seen was gone, and Donnie was eager to get out of the bathroom and back into the company of other people. Donnie caught his breath and calmed down. Looking down at the sink, he noticed something. There was blood dripping into the white porcelain bowl. He looked down at his hands and noticed there was 3 deep and distinct bloody marks on his wrist. They looked like claw marks. Donnie didn't remember scratching his wrist, but the scratches were there and they were painful. As he examined the source of the blood, he felt scared. Donnie had no idea how or why this was happening, and he knew that he would have a hard time explaining it to any rational human being. At this point, the Kiefer family had been waiting on Donnie for a few moments. The father of the family sent his son up to go check on the guest they had taken in, and as the son called out for Donnie decided that he didn't want to tell the family what had happened. He wasn't sure how he would even explain the terrifying experience if he wanted to. The Kiefer family was nice enough to take him in when no one else would, and he didn't want to start causing trouble for the family that believed in him when no one else did. When Donnie came down for dinner, the father of the Kiefer family, Bob, noticed he looked strange. He could see Donnie was pale and looked sickly, and could immediately tell that something was off about the boy they had taken in. As Donnie reached to grab some food on the table, Bob saw the cuts on Donnie's arm. He grabbed Donnie's hand and saw the blood marks on his wrist. Understandably, Bob was worried that this was something Donnie had done to himself. He asked Donnie why he had hurt himself, and Donnie responded slowly but passionately, "Bob, it wasn't me. There was something upstairs. I saw a man's face and he looked like the devil." Bob decided not to press Donnie on the situation. While he knew that Donnie was a good kid, he didn't know whether the boy was dealing with any mental issues, and seeing as Donnie would only be there for the weekend, he didn't want to cause any problems. Dinner continued on with a tension hanging in the air that no member of the Kiefer family seemed eager to address. They carried on like nothing had happened, finished up like it was any other Saturday. Bob figured he could just let this slide, and there would be no more trouble during Donnie's stay at the Kiefer's home. After dinner, the family gathered together in the living room. Bob believed Donnie. He didn't think that Donnie had hurt himself, but he still couldn't fully understand the situation. The mother of the Kiefer family started to fold laundry as the rest of the family gathered around the TV. Even with the shocking revelation of Donnie's hurt arm, Bob was determined to make this evening just like any other. It wasn't long before things stray far from normal, however. As the family lounged around together, they started to feel a coldness take hold of the room. Although the entire family felt the cold, only Donnie could recognize it as the same cold that had just filled the upstairs just a few hours earlier. Donnie knew what was coming as he sat on the couch and stared down at his lap. The family sat in silence as dread and uncertainty filled the minds of everybody in the room. The mother turned to her husband and said, "Bob, I think we have a problem." She pointed to the wall of the living room, and Bob saw what his wife was referring to. There was water running down the wall of their living room. The immediate thought going through Bob's mind was that they had a leaking pipe. This would be a little inconvenience, but it was something he knew how to handle. As his mind started thinking about the pipes in the wall and how he would go about fixing them, a thought came to his mind. There's no water on that side of the house. There aren't even pipes in the wall that could be causing this leak, and upon realizing this, Bob walked towards the wall to inspect the problem further. As he touched the water, he noticed that there was something off about the liquid. The water, he felt, was sticky and viscous, and there was an indescribable otherworldliness to it. It wasn't water, or at least it wasn't like any water Bob had ever felt. Before they could process what they were seeing, the family heard a sound from upstairs. The sound was over too quickly for Bob and the others to identify it, but it was definitely not a normal sound. It almost sounded like a menacing growl. A pervasive sense of fear came over the entire family. The parents brought their kids into their arms. Although they had experienced some frightening phenomena, the strangest was yet to come. Out of nowhere, Bob started to feel drops on his head. He looked up and noticed there was water dropping everywhere in the family room. It was like it was raining inside the house. There was water forming in the air before his very eyes and falling onto the carpet. Bob composed himself as he tried to understand what was going on and looked at the stairs and shuddered at the thought of going to the second floor. Bob decided to call his landlord, Ron. He didn't want to describe the problem to Ron because he knew that he would not believe him. Could you blame him? It's not every day that you have water pouring from your ceiling. The unexplainable rain continued until Ron and his wife got to the house. The landlord was at a loss for words. It wasn't raining outside currently, and it hadn't rained for weeks, so there couldn't be a leak in the roof. Ron suggested that he and Bob go upstairs to check on the problem, and Bob shuddered at this suggestion. He could still feel an uninviting presence coming from the upper level of the house, and he was not too keen on the idea of facing that presence head on. Bob composed himself and prepared to enter the upper level of the house. Although he was terrified, he knew that it was his responsibility to check on the house. Bob and Ron started to climb the stairs as Donnie sat thinking about what he had just experienced. Donnie knew there was an evil presence upstairs, and he was pretty certain that he knew what it was. Donnie was sure that it was his grandfather coming back to hurt him. It all seemed to line up so perfectly. His grandfather was an evil man, and he knew he would be evil even after his time on Earth was over. When Bob and Ron made it upstairs, they both felt a feeling of dread come over them. They started inspecting the rooms of the upper level, looking for some sort of rational explanation to what they had seen. They looked at the room directly above the living room and determined that the water wasn't leaking from there. As the two men further inspected the upper floor of the house, they made their way into the bathroom where Donnie was just attacked a few hours earlier. There was that same cold feeling they all had felt moments ago, coming from the room, and Bob felt that there was some sort of evil spirit in the bathroom. Although he could not see it, he knew something was up there with them. Something sinister was waiting for them. After the men completed their inspection of the upstairs, they headed back to the living room. It was still raining. Bob looked over at Donnie, who was still sitting on the couch. He called out to Donnie. No response. He called out again. Still no response. Bob could see that Donnie, while physically in the room with him, was far removed from the current situation. He was there, but he wasn't there. Ron could feel a strange presence coming from Donnie, and Donnie felt as if he was going into a trance. All of a sudden, the strangest thing happened with the water in the room. It started rising from the floor and flying towards the ceiling. It was as if the rain was falling in reverse. Bob was at complete loss for what to do at this point. He looked at Ron and said that he would feel more comfortable if the police were involved. Ron agreed, so Bob picked up the phone, dialed 911. Stroudsburg was a small town, so the officer that answered the phone immediately recognized the voice of Bob Kiefer. The Kiefers were new in town, and the police officer knew that Bob was not the type of person to exaggerate his stories. When Bob explained the situation, the officer told him that he might be better off calling a plumber for his current problem. But Bob was insistent that the officer come to his house. The officer agreed and took his squad car down to the Kiefer residence. When the officer arrived, the family left the house immediately. As the officers went into the house, they felt the same cold feeling everybody else had felt in the living room. The police observed the same gravity-defying droplets coming from the floor. And as they stood there in shocked silence, the officers saw a droplet form in the air between them and shoot itself into the darkness. It was as if the drop was luring them further into the dark house. As the officers looked at the house, the Kiefers started to feel suspicious of Donnie. The mother and Ron's wife cornered Donnie, demanding answers from him. They accused him of causing the problem and demanded that he stop the rain. Donnie was unresponsive, and he shrugged off the assault of words from the two women. As the woman laid into Donnie with their words, something unexpected happened. The cupboards flung open and pots and pans crashed down to the floor, and during the chaos, the family could see that Donnie was being raised into the air by some sort of force. As Donnie struggled in the air, that same force flung him into the corner of the room. When he hit the floor, Donnie came back to his senses. He knew that he had been attacked again, and he felt a familiar, sharp pain in his arm. He looked down and saw a crown carved into his arm, the same crown that he had seen on the man in the bathroom. At this point, the entire family was confused and shocked. while Bob and the others didn't know what was going on. They all knew that they were in the presence of pure evil. There was a demonic force at work in the Kiefer family house. Bob knew that there was some sort of demon in Donnie, and Donnie knew who it was. Donnie knew he was possessed by the spirit of his recently deceased grandfather. At this point, Bob was at a loss for words. He was a religious man, so he grabbed his Bible. He handed it over to his wife, who began to read from it out loud. As his wife read from the Bible, to hopefully cast out its spirit that was in Donnie, the water droplets in the room started turning their focus to her. Drops pelted Bob's wife as she continued reading. As the intensity in her voice grew, so did the intensity of the unexplained rain. It was as if the spirit in the house was attacking her through the raindrops. Rain pelted her as she read louder and louder to hopefully get through to Donnie. And after she finished her reading, the rain stopped and there was finally a quiet silence in the house. At this point, Donnie was back to being himself. He had experienced the same events that all the other people in the house did, but he wasn't quite conscious of it all. He said before it was like he was in a trance. He collected himself and stared at the rest of the family. He was at a loss for words. What could he even say to explain himself? He himself didn't even want to understand what was going on. He just hoped that the Kiefers wouldn't kick him to the curb as his own mother had done the day prior. The Kiefer family knew they had a problem on their hands. They had experienced unexplainable situations and they knew why it had happened. It was Donnie. The mother of the family claimed that she knew there was no problem with their house. They had never experienced anything like that until they had accepted Donnie into their home. They let Donnie stay the rest of the weekend, and then they decided they would have the courtesy to take him back to jail. After all that they had experienced, they were eager to return to their normal lives. And soon, Donnie's weekend pass expired and he was required to go back to jail. Bob dropped Donnie off in the prison, and this would be the last time that Bob and Donnie ever interacted. Although he was away from the houses where all of the craziness had happened, Donnie knew there was something inside of him now that lingered. Stories had spread about what happened over the weekend, and the prison guards and other inmates stayed away from Donnie. They could see there was something different about him. He carried a feeling of dread and uncertainty with him wherever he went. It was at this point that Donnie started to understand his newfound abilities. He started to feel that he can control the power that resided inside him. He could make it rain. Donnie Decker now believed he could control the rain, and other people in the jail could feel it as well. The warden could feel this supernatural presence emanating from Donnie, and he kept a close eye on him. While he had been a rather quiet and innocuous prisoner before, Donnie was now the center of attention in the prison, and it wasn't long before it started raining in Donnie's cell. Just as it had happened in the Kiefer household, it started happening all over the prison. Water would fall from the ceiling, rise from the floor, and fly in every direction during those indoor storms. The other inmates grew confused and scared as to how this was happening. No one had an answer. Donnie's cellmates started yelling at Donnie, demanding answers just as women had done a few days earlier. The cellmate, now terrified of what Donnie could do, wanted to be removed from Donnie's cell, where the unexplainable rain thundered down on the two men. The warden decided it would be smart to move Donnie into a more secure cell in the main cell block. As he was being prepared to move into his new cell, the guards decided to have some fun with Donnie. They had heard about his so-called powers and decided to tease him. They asked him if he could hit the warden with a raindrop from where he was, and he said, "I'll try." The men scoffed at Donnie's response and continuing to mock him until something would happen with the rain. Donnie had already felt greater control over his strange abilities, and even though he knew the guards were making fun of him, he decided to honor their request. As you could expect in any prison, the prisoners had not had a love for the warden, and Donnie would relish the experience to inconvenience the man who ran the prison that he was constricted to. Donnie began to focus his thoughts on the warden. He concentrated and pictured the warden eating in the brick room. As his mind grew more focused, he started snapping, and with every snap, a drop of rain materialized in the break room and hit the warden. After a few snaps, the warden looked down at his wet shirt, and he knew right away that Donnie Decker was behind this. Although he knew that Donnie was behind it, he couldn't understand how. Donnie was several locked doors away from the warden. There was no way that Donnie could have hit him. It was physically impossible. Donnie could not have hit the warden without the help of some other worldly presence. The warden went to check on Donnie, and when he saw him sitting quietly in his cell, he knew there was something wrong with him. The warden knew that Don was possessed. He didn't have physical proof or any evidence, but he could feel deep down there was something malicious inside Donnie. The warden thought about what he should do in this situation. He had never had to deal with anything remotely this strange before, and he was unsure of what could be done. He had already had Donnie moved to a different cell and was closely monitoring him. The warden was a religious man and decided he would have to go through religious means to cure the boy of what he thought was inside of him. As the warden weighed the option in his head, the others around Donnie were growing more and more unnerved by the minute. Those people in prison that interacted with Donnie said they felt sick to their stomachs just being around him. There was this universal feeling of uncertainty and uncomfortability that came with Don Decker. This boy, who had once messed around with the wrong crowd, was now associating himself with something far worse than any common thief or thug. The warden didn't even want to look at him. He didn't want to be around him, and knew that nobody could fix this problem except a minister. The warden decided to arrange an exorcism to hopefully cure the boy of the presence that had put the entire prison staff on edge. The practice of performing exorcism can be somewhat controversial. Many organized religions refuse to perform them without extensive permissions and evidence of a possession. There have been several cases of exorcisms performed that have had disastrous effects on the afflicted individual. While the warden knew that organizing an exorcism for one of his prisoners would be controversial and unorthodox, he felt that it was the only thing that could rid Donnie of the spirit that had taken hold inside of him. He called a local minister and prepared a room for the exorcism to be handled. They placed Donnie in a common area outside the main cell block that they referred to as the closet. The jail chaplain arrived armed with his Bible, holy water, and other tools commonly used in an exorcism. The chaplain first talked to Donnie before the exorcism began, and he told him that he was going to perform an exorcism so that the bad spirit inside of Donnie could be released from him. He said he was there to help, and that this was all for the salvation of Donnie's soul. Donnie sat in silence. He didn't make eye contact with the priest, and he waited for the ritual to begin. The warden watched anxiously as the priest entered Donnie's cell. The priest took Donnie's hand and started reading scriptures from the Bible. As the priest continued his convicted reading, a stench started to enter the cell. Donnie described the smell as the scent of rotting flesh. As the horrible stench filled the cell, the priest remained steadfast in his effort to cure Donnie of the force that was inside of him. And Donnie started feeling something stir inside of him. He felt a sick feeling in his stomach and knew there was something wrong with whatever had taken hold of him. As the force inside of him writhed and struggled, he felt more and more uncomfortable. He didn't want the priest to stop, but he was having a hard time dealing with the pain inside of him. And soon after the smell had entered the room, it began raining. The mysterious rain that followed Donnie wherever he was started forming in the air. This time, the rain took aim at the chaplain performing the exorcism. The rain swirled around the room, pelted the priest as he continued to read from his holy book. Donnie had never seen the rain as intense as it was during this very moment. As he looked at the soaking wet priest and then at the book in his hands, Donnie noticed that the rain would not hit the Bible. This peculiar aversion caught Donnie's attention as he sat in silence. Donnie was no longer in control of the rain. He wasn't commanding it as he had done so when he soaked the warden. He had never seen the rain act this way before, and he was curious as to how the book remained dry in the presence of all this chaos in this rainy room. The priest was talking very loudly at this point. It commanded the demon to go back to the pits of hell where it belonged. And the odor in the room intensified, and Donnie smelled death. As the exorcism continued, the turmoil inside Donnie intensified. With every word, the priest said, Donnie could feel something writhing within himself. He held on to every breath that he breathed as the priest continued his chant. The forces inside Donnie were restless, and even though he had previously embraced his abilities, Donnie was ready to break free from whatever was inside of him. After a few minutes, the priest commanded the spirit to leave the body of the boy, and Donnie let out a shout. The guards standing outside the door readied themselves to subdue Donnie if things were not going as according to plan. As Donnie's cries had subsided, the chaplain called out to the guards. He demanded to be let out of the room. His work was done, and he was ready to leave. Donnie opened his eyes and hoped that it was all over. He could feel a calm enter him that he had not felt in weeks, as the dark feelings that he had grown so accustomed to had subsided. He let out a gasp of relief. The spirit was gone, and Donnie Decker was free. The warden called the exorcism a success, and the prison was put at ease with the mysterious case of the inexplicable rain. The warden thanked the chaplain, and the guards escorted Donnie back to his cell in the main cell block. Donnie was quiet the whole way back, and he would be back to his usual self for the rest of his time in prison. It had been 39 years since Donnie Decker experienced these unexplainable ordeals. He claims that nothing like this had ever happened since, and he was free from the forces inside of him, and he hasn't seen any of the mysterious rain since the exorcism. Donnie finished his prison sentence and lived a rather innocuous life afterwards. He still maintains to this day that the spirit that possessed him was his grandfather. Fast forward to 2012, and Donnie was arrested and charged with arson. He turned himself in after a restaurant was set on fire in his home state of Pennsylvania. It is unknown why Donnie decided to return to a life of crime 30 years after his initial arrest, but that is for him to answer for. The story of Don Decker has cemented itself in paranormal history. He is often referred to as the Rain Man for his unexplainable ability to make it rain indoors. He was a part of history, and his story remains a shocking example of the power of lingering memories. There is something innately terrifying about the idea of witches. Perhaps it is the fact that they have such a strong historical significance for many areas of the world. Our minds are often brought back to the Salem witch trials that happened in Massachusetts during the 1600s. We think of women being burned at the stake and the paranoia that seemed to devour each and every member of the small Puritan society. The fascination that American people had with witches more than 300 years ago was not an isolated incident. Many people in various cultures are still wary of the idea of witchcraft and dark magic. The people of Mexico have legends of witches and worshipped dark saints. They teach their children to live in fear of the evil women who seek to take them away from their families, where they will never be seen again. Most of these people brush these stories off as being tales made up to scare children, but what if there is some truth to these tales? Witchcraft is a broad term that has been used by religious organizations to refer to any sort of ritual or belief that is closely aligned to paganism, an ancient religion that worshipped various different gods. While some of the pagan beliefs involve the invocation of the dark and merciless gods, there are also aspects of paganism that are found in everyday life. A lot of the widely celebrated holidays were originally pagan holidays that have been updated and given a new meaning. Halloween was one of the most celebrated pagan holidays and still retains some of the original mystery and intrigue that defined the holiday many centuries ago. While many aspects of paganism, and therefore witchcraft, have made it into societal norms of the world today, there are still some that continue to practice the more unholy aspects of the ancient practices. Today, we will be diving into an eyewitness encounter of a group of people that encountered some of these practitioners of ancient magic. In South Carolina, in the year 1991, Ken Fisher and his new family were looking for something more in life. Ken had just recently married his wife Linda, and with his new marriage, brought a new family together. Linda had a son, Matthew, that was living with her at the time, and Ken was eager to make a good impression on his new stepson. While these three will be the main focus of the account, The family also had 6 younger children living with them at the time. Ken had been an insurance salesman for years in the southern part of the United States and was always able to provide for himself and his family. After a while of selling insurance, the industry began to dry up, and Ken was worried about his ability to support his new family. He decided to pursue a new career, one that would sustain him both financially and spiritually. Ken decided he was going to go through seminary so he could become a preacher. He had been a faithful member of a Christian church for his entire life, and he thought it was his time to join the ministry. Linda was supportive of this new direction that Ken was taking and was even eager to help him on his journey towards becoming a pastor. While Linda was supportive of her new husband, she knew that the path that he was on would not be an easy one. Although Ken's job as an insurance salesman wasn't bringing in as much money as it used to, it would still pay him more than he would making while he was studying to be a preacher. The family decided that it was worth the risk. They knew they could afford to get by with a little bit less than they had, and Ken's ambition to be a preacher seemed to be really good for him. Due to the high cost of living where they were currently located at the time, the family decided to relocate to South Carolina, where life was a little less expensive. They were sad to leave their old life behind, but the family was confident that an even more promising life awaited them in South Carolina. They packed their things into their station wagon and headed for their new life. While both of the parents were eager to get on their life in South Carolina, Matt was having a harder time with the transition. He was a teenager at the time and did not want to leave his school and all of his friends behind. Moving always seems to be tougher on teenagers. Matt had just carved out a place for himself in his school and was beginning to enjoy the circle of friends that he had made. He wanted to support his stepdad in whatever he did, but he wished that what he did wouldn't bring them so far away from everything he knew. Matt was quiet about his feelings, however. He knew that he had very little control over the situation and thought that vocalizing his opinion would just make things worse. As the family drove to their new house, Matt tried to stay positive about the change. He liked the nature around where they were at and could see himself fitting in nicely with the people that he saw walking down the street. As the family started to approach their new home, Matt started feeling more and more hopeful. The family pulled into the driveway and looked at their new house. They were all stunned by what they saw. The house was beautiful. It had a porch that wrapped around the entire house and a big yard. It was truly a beautiful southern home that looked like it jumped straight out of a history book. The family was excited to settle into this new home, and they loved their old place, but they were shocked that they got such a nice deal on such an extravagant house. Ken looked at his wife and smiled. They were both in agreement that the house was perfect. Even Matt was blown away by the house. He was eager to get himself settled into what seemed to be a nice new place for him to live. The entire family was ecstatic. Their expectations had been completely surpassed, and they were now more than willing to accept whatever their new life in South Carolina had to offer them. When the family arrived, they were met by the realtor. She welcomed them with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Ken started walking towards the house and was surprised to see another family standing in the doorway. The previous family that had stayed in the house was still in the process of moving out. Linda was a little bothered that they would not be able to move their stuff in all the way at first, but she put on a nice face and decided to make the most of what they had been given. After all, if they were able to get such a nice house for such a low price, then she would be willing to put up with whatever life had to throw at her. Matt was a little more skeptical of the house. To him, the unusually low price of the house means that something had to be wrong with it. He decided to make the most of the situation, but he also made sure to keep an eye on any possible problems that the house may have had. As the family began to move their things into the house, the previous renters and the realtor offered to help them. They gladly accepted their help, and all the people at the house began to move the items from the car to the house. While Matt was taking a look around the house, he noticed something strange. There was a door on the side of the house that had a large padlock on it. He knew that his family was only renting the house, but he still found it odd that there was such a large lock on a door that should have been available to them. It looked like there was something else to the house than what the family had decided to rent. The realtor was taking Linda on a tour of the house. Everything seemed normal for the first few minutes of the tour, but then the realtor started listing off rules that the family needed to follow if they were going to stay there. Linda was used to normal rules that came with renting a house. No pets, no smoking, no repainting, things like that. However, The rules that the realtor had for them were a lot stranger than the rules they were used to following. As the two women reached the living room of the house, a large rose-colored rug caught Linda's eye. It was worn out and faded and looked like it had been there since the house was first constructed. The realtor then told Linda that they were not to move or cover up the rug. The owners of the house were very insistent that the rug stay exactly where it was. Linda was interested in why she had to follow such strict rules, but she decided not to press the realtor further. When the owner of the house passed Matt in the hallway, he decided to use this opportunity to ask her about the padlocked room. He was expecting a usual response. Maybe it was a storage room, or maybe it contained the water heater. The lady looked at him with a shocked impression. She told him that the locked room was the room that her uncle had committed suicide in. Matt was disturbed at this revelation. If the room didn't feel quite right to him before, it definitely didn't now. The woman told him that they kept the room locked out of respect for her deceased uncle. Matt wasn't feeling so confident about the house at this point, and he did not like the idea of sleeping in a house that seemed to have such a strange feeling around it. While Linda was out in the yard, she went to go take a look at the shed behind the house. She noticed that there was a large rock that sat in front of the shed door. Wanting to get in, Linda started pushing on the rock, and the realtor quickly ran over and yelled at Linda, telling her to stop messing with the rock. She told Linda that the family was not allowed to go into the shed, and that rock should remain in front of the door at all times. Linda was surprised at the panicked tone in the lady's voice. She thought about asking more questions, but at this point, she was done hearing about all the rules that the house had, and she just wanted to go get settled in with her family. After all, the house was nice, and she knew that she could handle living with a few odd rules, so as long as they were still getting such a good deal. Matt decided to speed things along by helping the old tenants move their things out of the house and into their moving trucks. After they had moved everything that the previous family had in the house, the family headed out in their truck. As they were leaving, Matt said goodbye to the mother of the previous family, wished her a safe journey to wherever they were headed to, and the lady looked back at Matt and told his family to be careful. She said that house was full of death. Then she drove away, and the family never saw them again. These words sent shivers down Matt's spine. The first night that they spent in the house was a rough one. He couldn't sleep, and he definitely could not stop thinking about the ominous message that the woman had left with him. He was lying in his bed, and he started to hear a squeaking sound coming from the door to his room. He looked over to see the door handle twisting back and forth, and Matt knew that nobody else was awake in the house, so he couldn't imagine who was trying to get into his room at the time. He watched the handle twist back and forth for about a minute, and the door just flew open. Matt, who jumped, looked back at the doorway, but there was nobody there. And although the door had flung open, it stopped before it hit the wall, like someone had grabbed it. Matt was waiting for somebody to come through the doorway. Nothing had ever come through. However, he got up out of bed and walked towards the doorway. He prepared himself to see someone or something standing in the hall outside the room. When he walked into the hall, he could not see anything. He began walking through the hall, and a sinking feeling began to fill his head. He didn't know how, but he knew that there was something behind him. Matt quickly turned around and saw a flash of something behind him. It was only there for a second, so he could not get a good look. But Matt was almost certain that he had just seen a woman standing in the hallway behind him. Matt didn't know what to do. He couldn't just tell his parents that he thought the house was haunted. He didn't want to scare them away from the nice house they were in. Besides, he knew that he sounded crazy. He decided to keep what he had seen to himself. He went back to bed and fell asleep. While the main focus of this account has been Linda, her husband Ken, and her son Matt, the family was a large one. There were 7 children that lived in the house along with Ken and Linda. Most of them were little, with the 2 oldest being the only teenagers at the house. Linda had her work cut out for her when it came to taking care of all the kids. There were a lot of chores to handle, but she was happy to do them and support her family. During one of the days that the family was staying in the house, the kids had all gone outside to kick a soccer ball around. They had been having a good time, enjoying the nice weather, when one of the kids kicked the ball high into the air. The ball fell straight into a hole on the roof of the shed. Ken had not heard the warning that the realtor had given his wife, so he began to move the rock in front of the door. Linda ran outside, screaming and shouting at her husband, warning him not to move the rock. Ken carried on and finally rolled out the rock from the door, and as soon as he did, this large gust of wind came rushing from the shed and flung the door open, and the family could not believe what they were seeing. The gust from the shed blew back several members of the family. Linda looked at the open door of the shed and felt that they had just released something that should have stayed locked in the shed. That night, Linda was sitting in a rocking chair in the living room. The rest of the family had gone to sleep, and she was trying to relax by knitting something for one of her children. She got an urge to check to see if the front door was locked. The family was far away from any other house, but given the events that had happened earlier in the day, she knew she would feel a lot safer if the door was locked. When she walked over to the front door, she saw something out in the yard. She could see the silhouette of a man. He was hanging from the tree in the front yard. As he swayed back and forth in the wind, Linda could not believe her eyes, and now she knew there was definitely something wrong with the house. She decided to investigate further and walked out the front door to the tree in the yard. She then got to the tree, and the man was gone. Linda went back inside the house and tried to rationalize what she had just seen. She just decided to go to bed and try to forget that anything ever happened. As the days went on, Ken began struggling balancing his family life with his studies. He would be gone for almost 12 hours out of the day to study and attend seminary. This began to weigh on the large family, as taking care of 7 kids was a monumental responsibility for Linda. Matt had started to resent his stepfather for being gone so much of the day. He started taking on responsibilities that would usually go to Ken, such as taking care of the kids and doing chores around the house. As the family started to clean out more and more of the house, they came across strange things. One day, Linda was cleaning out a room in the back of the house. She looked into one of the dressers in the room, and inside, she found the bones of several different animals. She didn't know what to make of this finding, but she did not feel good about it. Several other strange occurrences happened to their family during their stay in the house. One day, Matt was walking around the perimeter of the house when he saw a little girl standing in one of the windows. Assuming it was his sister, he waved at her and she waved back. Continuing his walk around the house, he saw that same sister that he thought he had just seen inside playing in the yard. Matt went back into the house and his curiosity got the best of him. He wanted to see the inside of that room that he saw the girl in. He went up to the room and did not see anybody in the room. Matt was a little freaked out by this experience, but tried to come up with some sort of explanation that would make sense in his head. The family seemed determined to make the best out of their seemingly haunted house and chose to ignore what many people would have seen as warning signs. One day, while the rest of the family was away, Matt invited one of his friends over to the house. The two decided to get into the locked room in the house, and Matt's friend James had brought tools with him to get rid of the lock. The lock came off rather easily, and the two took a deep breath before they opened the door. When they opened the door, a blast of cold air came out of the room. It was a hot day outside, so this didn't seem to make any sense to the two friends. When Matt and James stepped into the room, it was like walking into a time capsule. The room looked untouched and how it must have looked when the previous resident had died. As the two walked through the room, they could smell the scent of fresh cigarette smoke in the room. No one in the house smoked, so this did not make sense to the two boys. As the boys investigated the room, they heard a loud crashing coming from upstairs. Now, determined to investigate all the secrets that the house had to offer, the two decided to head to the source of the noise. When the two climbed up the stairs, they felt a chill come over their bodies. All the doors in the hallway were closed. This was odd, as the family always kept them open. James, wanting to be the voice of reason, said they may have been shut and slammed from a draft in the house. As the two continued down the hallway, they heard the same crashing sound again. When they turned around, all of the doors in the hallway were now open. James could not come up with a valid explanation for why the doors had flung open. The two decided to stop their investigation, and Matt felt that the door that they had opened was not to keep the family from entering the room, but rather to keep something inside of the room from entering the rest of the house. That night, Linda was enjoying her quiet time in the rocking chair in the living room, as she often did. The air in the room never seemed to stand still. There was always something that made her feel on edge as she tried to relax. She could feel a tension in the air as if somebody was watching her. She walked around the house, decided to check on all the doors, and while she was walking through the house, she smelt that same cigarette smoke coming from the upper level of the house. She climbed the stairs and followed the scent of the smoke to her own room. She peered inside and saw a man standing in the window smoking a cigarette. She gasped and flipped on the lights, and the man was gone. Matt had heard his mother gasp and went to find her. The two decided to sit in the kitchen and finally have a discussion about what they had seen. When Linda told Matt what she had seen, he could hardly believe it. Matt had smelt the same smoke in the locked room earlier and was now sure that what he had seen and what he had been dealing with was real. He told his mom about his previous encounters in the house, and the two were both relieved to not be alone in this horrifying ordeal. As the two discussed what they had seen and what they were going to do about it, they heard the sound of glass shattering right next to them. A glass had fallen from the shelf next to them and shattered on the ground. They looked at the glass in disbelief before they had time to process what they had seen. More glasses began to fly off the shelves around them, and the two took cover underneath the table. They were under attack. As the glasses rained down around them, they tried to come to grips with what they were witnessing. Upstairs, one of the daughters of the family had just woken up from a terrifying nightmare. She had seen an old lady with white hair in her dreams and had felt more scared than she had ever in her entire life. After the glasses stopped crashing to the ground, Linda went upstairs to comfort her daughter. The strange experiences and hauntings that the family had seen were beginning to weigh on Linda. She did not feel safe in the house and was worried that whatever was in the house was affecting her children at this point. Matt was seeing his mother unravel and knew that he had to step up to protect his family. He decided to look for answers as to what was inside their house. So he went to the local library to look through years and years of local newspaper, hoping to find something that would illuminate him on the history of the house. As he looked through the newspapers, he found one article about a man that had hung himself in the front yard. He began to find more and more about this house. There was a little girl who had died from falling down the stairs. Could that have been the girl that he had seen in the window? The more that Matt read about this house, the worse it seemed to get. He found another article that talked about another suicide that had happened just recently. How could there have been so many accidents and suicides in this home? Matt began to think that there was some sort of curse on the house. Matt and Linda both decided to tell Ken about what they had seen. He believed them and began to feel guilty about his absence in the house. He was determined to stick around and be the father that he knew he could be for his family. This new determination to his family was greatly appreciated, but it didn't do anything to slow down the strange occurrences in the house. One night, when Matt was shaving, he saw something moving around in the sink. As he peered down into the bowl, he saw a large, hairy spider crawling out of the sink. Matt, completely terrified of spiders and could not believe his eyes, he was paralyzed with fear as he saw more and more spiders crawling out of the sink. There must have been almost 20 of them crawling around the bathroom, and at this point, Matt was convinced there was something in the house that was trying to harm him. He ran out of the room and out onto the front porch. As he grappled with what to do with the house and all of the terrifying occurrences he had seen, he decided that it was time to take action against the house. He went to the local pastor, had told him what was going on. The pastor told him that he needed more time to anoint the house to cleanse it from the evil spirits. He gave Matt a bottle of oil and instructed him on how to anoint the house to ward off the dark spirits that they had seen. Matt was told that he had to anoint every member of his family before he started to work on the house itself. After each member of the family had been anointed, he began spreading the holy oil on every entrance and exit that the house had. They put the oil on every door and the window that the house had, while Linda read from the Bible. They had taken care of every point of entrance in the house except for two. Matt knew that he had to anoint the chimneys as well. He climbed up a ladder, got onto the roof. He walked towards the first chimney and spread the oil on it. Matt would have to walk across the pitch of the roof to get to the second chimney. So he slowly started to walk over. As Matt made his way over to the second chimney, he felt a pressure come over his entire body. He knew that the house did not want him to finish the anointing, and he could feel it, trying to stop him. Matt noticed something on his arm, and he heard a buzzing sound coming from all around him. He was surrounded by hornets. He had no idea where they had come from, and he tried to keep calm as he walked over to the other chimney. Matt was allergic to bees and was afraid that the hornet would sting him and seriously injure him. He made his way to the second chimney and spread the oil on it, securing every entrance and exit to the house. As he spread the oil, The hornets started stinging him all over. He panicked and stumbled around until he lost his footing and fell off the roof. He landed in the bushes on the side of the house and was thankfully relatively unharmed. Matt was thankful to be alive, and the family decided that it was time to leave the house behind. Ken and Linda quickly moved the family out of the house and to another house about an hour away. While they were happy to leave the house behind them, they knew that they were obligated to clean the house up before they left. Ken and Matt decided to head back to the house and clean it as quickly as they could. When Matt was sweeping the room with the big rug, he accidentally pulled up a corner of the rug. He saw some symbols on the ground and decided to investigate further. When Matt and Ken pulled the rug off the ground, they found something they would never forget. Carved into the ground was a large pentagram with strange runes and markings all over it. The two stopped cleaning the house right away and waited outside for the landlord to come. The landlord arrived in a silver Cadillac, and when the door of the car opened, a beautiful woman stepped out. She walked past Ken and Matt into the house, and the two other women stepped out of the car and waited for the first woman to return. When the first woman walked out of the house, she was furious. She demanded to know what the family had done to the house. They claimed that it was empty now and that they would have to do something to get them to come back. Ken and Matt could not believe what they were hearing. As the woman left in their car, Matt thought that he recognized them. He could not prove it, but he felt that the woman in the car were the realtor, the previous tenant, and the owner of the house, except they all looked younger. The women drove off, and Matt and Ken headed back to their new home. Ken and Linda's family was happy to move on from what they had experienced in the house, and they lived the rest of their lives without any more significant paranormal encounters. As far as they could tell, the haunted house they had stayed in was the work of witches, and they maintain the truthfulness of their story to this day.